friends, welcome back to my channel, to my bedroom, to my isolation period while I recover from COVID. Thank you for everyone who wished me well after my last video. Sorry I didn't edit it. I literally just filmed and posted it the same day because I was just and not wanting to edit. But I will be editing this video, so it won't be an hour long. It will, however, be super chock filled with info that I'm hoping will be entertaining to you. I always love watching my favorite booktubers talk about what they read that year in terms of like numbers, like raw statistics. And this year, one of the most exciting things that I did for my reading was that I joined Storygraph. So I will actually leave the link to my Storygraph account in the description if you'd like to follow or friend me. That's where I update my reading most frequently now. And mainly it's because I just freaking love the graphs. Like, I love the pie charts. I love the graphs that they produce based on your reading. It's not perfect, but it is really user-friendly, and they're just like a lovely team of people. So do go sign up, and then you can see what I'm reading and you can keep up to date with my reading as and when I finish books. But basically this video is just thanks to Storygraph, because I couldn't have measured a lot of these statistics without their help. So thank you to Storygraph, and without further ado, let's get into this video. I'm so excited. So this is my full breakdown of everything that I read in 2021. I'm not going to be naming a lot of the books, but I will be talking about the types of books. I will address the question of how many books I bought this year, which someone had commented asking me about after my no buy year fails video. Which is a super valid question, and I've tried to calculate it like quite roughly just now before turning on the camera, so hopefully that I'll have an answer to that. And then I'm not going to be talking about like my favorite books or anything like that, but I will be trying to address some things about like why I've tracked the things that I've tracked, why I think it's important, and how I hope to use this information to help me reach my New Year reading goals. If you are curious, I did set myself like some personal reading goals, and they were to read more diversely, super immeasurable, to track my reading better. So I joined Storygraph, did that. I hope to read 8 books with The Reader's Resistance, my book club, but we kind of went on an unannounced hiatus midway through the year, and we only ended up reading 4 books. I didn't want to buy any new books. Obviously, I had that no buy year. Did that for 6 months. I wanted to read 1 full book in Arabic, and I didn't. I only read 1 chapter of a book in Arabic. I wanted to read more fiction. My goal was to read 6 fiction books. I way exceeded that number. And then I also hoped to review every book that I read, either in writing or on this channel, and I think I did mostly that. Like I think I reviewed at least 80% of the books that I read this year, so that's really exciting. I feel like I did all right on my goals, but the main goal that I feel like was really hard to keep track of and hard to measure throughout the year was read more diversely. But we'll come back to that at the end of the video, because that's gonna reoccur after we break down the statistics. So let's do this. The biggest question you guys probably have, the biggest question I have at the end of a year, is often not the number of books that I read, but it is the easiest thing to just say and to measure. And so I'm really happy with the fact that this year I read 50 books. Especially since I didn't set myself like a numerical goal. I was quite surprised when I put all my info into Storygraph, and then I realized like I was well on my way to 50, and that it was going to be really easy to reach that number by the end of the year. So I did read 50 books this year. Compared to previous years, I'll put the chart on the screen that shows you how many books I read each month, because as you can see, like, it fluctuates a lot. I start really strong with 7 books in January, dips down in Feb, kind of waves around the like 3 to 5 books, March, April, May, June, and then I only read 1 book in July. And I talked about that in one of my wrap-ups. I don't know what happens in August, but I think I was doing loads of research and I was just reading loads of books. But as you can see from the, actually, no, sorry, that's pages. That's weird. So yeah, it peters off. Like, I slowly make my way back in August, but somehow I read an exorbitant amount of pages in August as well, even though I only read a few books. September, I read loads of more books. Clearly, I finished some books that I started in August, hence the like reversal of the blue and the red. And then October, October and November were doing pretty well. And then I only, again, read 1 book in December because I fell quite ill at the beginning of December. And now it's the end of December. So that's basically the kind of fluctuation of my reading throughout the year. Obviously, I've been trying to do like seasonal wrap-ups, so like a wrap-up every 3 months this year. And so it seemed like I've been reading quite consistently, but actually in practice, I hover around the like 3 to 4 books a month mark, with some exceptions, namely like summer, like in August, and then October, I think I was reading loads of things for class, and so that was like October and November, I just exceeded every expectation, and I read so many books that, again, shot me up to 50. The cool thing that I want to show you that Storygraph is able to do, comparing not only months of this year, but previous years to each other, is this graph, which shows you that like how my reading has improved over the course of the years. I only started tracking my reading in 2019, and I actually read 42 books that year, but some of them were in different languages, and some of them just I couldn't find on Storygraph, so it says 37 books in 2019. But my page count, you can see, is also like quite low. It's around the 6,000 mark. And in 2020, although I read only 32 books or 34 books, something like that, I actually read more pages in 2020 than I did in 2019. So I actually technically read more in 2020, even though the number of books had changed. And this year I read 10,000 pages, over 10,000 pages. I think it's 10,058, so not that much more than 10,000. And I read 50 books, so it's like my highest sort of reading count of any previous year, which is amazing. But I just wanted to point this out because it's really cool to be able to see page numbers. I thought that this year, like, okay, I'd read a lot, but I read a lot of short books. As you can see, we'll get into that now, like, the percentage of books that I've read that are under 300 pages are 88% of the books that I read were under 300 pages this year, with only 12% of the books that I read, aka like 4 or 5 books I read, were over 300 pages. So that's a really huge majority of like super short books. And that's just the kind of reader that I am, but I still managed to read more pages than I'd ever read before, which is quite cool to realize. In terms of fiction versus nonfiction, I throughout the year had been like quite solidly at like 75% nonfiction with a 25% fiction. And then that swing in October, November that you saw on the graph, that's when I was reading loads of things for class, and I just went in the complete opposite direction, basically only reading fiction for the second half of the year, or like the third quarter. And so my overall average has now become around 60-40. It's 59% nonfiction, 41% fiction. So that's pretty cool to know. I'm quite happy with that. I think I still I wouldn't necessarily prefer to have 50-50 in that statistic. I like reading more nonfiction than fiction. I find it easier to read nonfiction than fiction because I can read nonfiction any state of mind, but I can't read fiction any state of mind. I need like peace of mind and like the emotional energy to like escape into another world when I'm reading fiction, especially if it's a longer novel. But yeah, that's pretty cool. The moods and the genres. So apparently my biggest mood or my top 3 moods, let's say, are reflective, challenging, and emotional books, with the next few being informative, dark, adventurous, and funny, I guess. I don't really know. I would have to click into this graph to figure out like what moods people categorize these books as. I haven't actually put in my own data about the books and whether I thought that they were reflective, challenging, emotional, informative, all of these keywords. These are the Storygraph users have included these words in reviews of a book, but I haven't actually reviewed my own reading on on this basis, so I don't actually know that that's the case. But anyway, according to most Storygraph users, the stuff that I read tends to be reflective, challenging, and emotional. So that's pretty cool, I guess. And then just wrapping up here with the graphs, and then we'll get into my own data, which will not be as visually pleasing, so I apologize in advance. The genres, there's a lot of genres. I don't know how I feel about the term genre. I've really questioned it quite a lot over the last couple of years, trying to run a book club where we only read nonfiction and then questioning what counts as nonfiction. There's a really big debate about the difference between fiction and nonfiction, especially narrative nonfiction. But anyway, so the main genre that I read, it's clear, is poetry, followed by essays, followed by LGBTQ and philosophy and classics. Those are tied. Then we've got like feminism, sci-fi, literary, short stories. I don't really know how I feel about this, but I mean, one thing is clear. I read a lot of poetry, and I've read a lot of essays this year, which is quite cool. And finally, was there anything else before we move on? No, so that is it for my Storygraph breakdown. Now we move on to like the fun facts section. This, I think I stole this from either Ariel Bassett or Books by Lanes, two of my favorite booktubers. I'll leave links in the description to their videos. They do stats videos every year that I absolutely love. And I think Books by Lanes especially, she did this in her last year's video, and I just loved learning this random information. So here's some fun facts about my reading this year. The shortest book that I read in terms of page number has been The Machine Stops by E.M. Forster. This is a short story in the Penguin Modern Classics series. And I talked about it in my last wrap-up, so you can go and check that out. But it's a really cool like sci-fi speculative fiction written in the last century. Oh, this short story is 48 pages, by the way. The longest book that I read in terms of length is actually A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor by Hank Green, and it's crazy to me that this book I technically read in 2021. Like, it blows my mind. This year has been so long. This has been the longest year. I don't understand. But yeah, apparently, according to Storygraph, I read this, or at least finished it this year, and this was 452 pages. So that is the longest book that I read. It is quite a chunker, but it's so readable. Loved it. Sequel to An Absolutely Remarkable Thing, which was awesome. And yeah, we stand the Green Brothers. We love Hank. And this is a great book. Totally worth the read. So both sci-fi. The oldest book that I read in terms of publication date was Candide by Voltaire. I read this for class. I did not read this edition. This edition is like the very popular edition, which is like translated in this like super old school language way. We were assigned a different translation by Burton Rafell, I think his name is, and it's so much more readable. If you guys can get your hands on that version of Candide, it's so much more readable than this like super old school version of it. But anyway, I really like this book, and this was published in 1759, so that is the oldest book in terms of publication date that I read this year. And the newest book that I read in terms of publication date this year was Rafell by Sarah Moss. This was actually published this year in November of 2021, and I swear I picked this up like the day after it got released to the bookstores. So I was thinking of writing an essay about it, decided not to, but I did read it and love it. And it's about a woman who is in quarantine, is in isolation, and she decides, I don't have any symptoms, you know, I'm not putting anyone else at risk if I go for a walk. And then she goes for a walk and she has a fall, and then a lot of people are put at risk, basically. So it's a little bit of a moral dilemma, and it's a story exploring that, but it's also just exploring the pandemic and people's different perspectives on the pandemic. And yeah, for a pandemic novel, I found it very not anxiety inducing, like excuse me. For a pandemic novel, I found it like quite readable. I wasn't overwhelmed at any point by like, you know, pandemic anxiety while reading it, although obviously the situation that Sarah Moss creates is quite an anxious situation. The fact that it was a pandemic novel didn't make me as anxious as I thought it would, because I have tried reading other pandemic novels throughout the pandemic and I just haven't been able to, but this one is pretty good, and it was, as I said, published this year, last month, so that's the newest book. Other fun facts about my reading is my most read authors. I've actually got 5 most read authors this year. I don't have their books on me, but I read 2 books by each of these authors, so clearly none of them have like won the most read category. But I read 2 poetry collections by Carol Ann Duffy. I read Sincerity and Hand in Hand, which is a love poem anthology that I talked about in my last wrap up. I read 2 books by Carmen Maria Machado this year, basically both of her published works. Like, I don't know that she's written anything else in like a bind up book published form. She is a magical realist horror writer, and she writes short stories, and she's also written a memoir, and I'm just desperately waiting for her to write a novel. Please, Carmen Maria Machado, grace us with your novel. I am desperate. I read 2 books by Maya Angelou this year. I read Celebrations, which is her poetry collection, and I also read Letters to My Daughter, which is her essay collection / memoir, autobiographical memories sort of situation. That was great, amazing. The audiobook is narrated by Maya Angelou, and it is beautiful and heartbreaking. Then I also read 2 books by Mary Oliver. Who's surprised? Nobody. I read Blue Horses, and I read Long Life, which is an essay collection that includes some of her poems, but is mainly her talking about her relationship with her long-term partner, and her relationship to God, and her relationship to her dogs, her relationship to like her hometown and all that stuff. And finally, I read 2 books by Sarah Moss, who I've just mentioned. Rafell by Sarah Moss I read, and I also read Ghost Wall this year. So those were my most read authors. Nobody has broken the 3 book mark this year, but I read lots of women. It seems multiple books by lots of different women. And on that note, let's get into the author identities. I feel like that's a good segue to talk about, as a percentage of 100 and out of 50 books, how many of those books were written by women, were written by people of color, were written by etc., etc., like different identities. That's the next section of this. Before I get into it, I would like to say that I think this is a really important thing to consider. I wouldn't necessarily say it's super important to have your reading be led by like an author's identity. Like, you shouldn't necessarily just read a book because it's by like a Black author, or just read a book because it's by a woman. But I do think identity matters, and it matters because if we're not aware of it, and this is particularly true for myself, I in the past have not been aware of it, and I've read so many white men. There have been so many white men on my bookshelves, and I've read very little like Arab writers, writers of color, women, non-binary folks. Like, I've read so few diverse authors from different backgrounds because I wasn't thinking about this. And so I'm not necessarily saying like this is the be all and end all of a metric of like whether I'm a good reader, or I'm being like diverse enough in my reading, or whether I'm woke or whatever. Like, that's literally not what this is about. But this is, to me, something that's important because I do want to read more diversely, and I think there's no way of doing that within an already biased system and an already biased publishing industry. So that's my little 2 cents on that. But let's get into how many of these books were written by what kind of people, right? So 28 out of 50 of the books that I read were written by women, which I think is probably the highest it's ever been. I haven't verified that statement because I haven't actually looked back at my last year's or previous year's statistics, but I'm pretty sure I've been consistently reading more women every year ever since I have been tracking whether I've been reading women every year. So feeling pretty good about that. However, of those 28 out of 50 women, only 7 of those 28 women were not white women. Just a horrifying statistic. 7. Only 7 books by non-white women. So basically I read 21 books by white women and 7 books by non-white women. And then obviously the remainder of that number, the rest of that number, so 22 out of 50 of the books that I read were written by men. However, were any of those 22 men non-white men? Only 3 of the 22 men that I read were non-white men, and that's a really disappointing statistic. I need to read more men of color, men of different backgrounds. So overall, we have 7 non-white women, 3 non-white men, basically 10 out of 50 of the books that I read, which is only 20% of my overall reading this year, has been from people of color, which is really disappointing. I thought I would have done better on this, and I think throughout the year, throughout most of the first half of the year, I was doing really well on reading people of color. And then I think basically as soon as I started my MA, and I stopped seeking specific types of books, I kind of fell into just reading the popular thing, reading whatever's like I'm hearing about, and that's so much of the publishing industry in the UK as well. And like in bookshops, you just see all of these books being promoted and you don't really think about who's writing them, and it ends up being that the majority of the books that I've read in the second half of the year have been by white people. So not super thrilled about that. We're still working on it. But yeah, so that's the statistic so far. 20% people of color, not great, not doing great. And then the final thing that I was really curious to look at, I know throughout the year I've been trying to track whether I'm reading like LGBT stories, but I realized like that's a really hard metric to measure because Are we asking about the author? Are we asking about the story itself? Like, does it have LGBT representation? Like what exactly is LGBT about an LGBT story? That's like the question, I guess. And so that's not one of the identities that I'm looking at in this wrap up, but it is something that I am trying to be more aware of. But the final thing I thought would be interesting to look at, how many of the books that I read were written by non-Western authors or set in non-Western communities. And this is the saddest statistic of all. It's only 5% of the books. It's 2.5. I don't know what the 0.5 is. I think I was like on the fence about one of the books, or maybe I started a book and I didn't finish it. I'm not 100% sure how I've calculated this. I trust my past self, but I'm just like not 100% sure how I've calculated 2.5. But I'm pretty sure only 2 of the books that I finished this year were written by non-Western authors, and maybe the 0.5 is for like mixed race or mixed background people or like immigrants, but still like 2.5 out of 50 out of 50. So like the vast majority, 95% of the books that I've read this year have been written by authors from the West, from the global North, and that is really, really, really disappointing. As someone from the Middle East and someone who has like a keen interest in reading from different backgrounds, and definitely not necessarily just reading about people based in the UK, the US, or Canada, like I can't believe that my natural reading rhythms, my natural reading habits, my natural like, unfiltered reading desires have led me down this path. And especially as someone who's like recently become a literature student, like becoming aware of this, something's got to change. Something has got to change. So yeah, those were the statistics. Hope you found that interesting. I definitely opened my eyes a lot. Would be curious to hear how many of the books that you've read this year have been written by women of color, people of color, and non-Western authors. Leave those stats in the description because I would be really, really curious about that. And then finally, before we get into like my goals, I will address the question of how many books did I buy this year, because I did try to go on a no-buy year. I did not buy books for about 6 months. And then, so how many books did I buy since then? And I've just very roughly calculated this before turning on the video. I have bought 35 books of like various genres, like fiction, nonfiction, etc. But I basically didn't read them this year. I bought 15 books for research. And none of these books that I'm mentioning here count towards like the books that I was allowed to buy at the beginning of the year. So I did set some rules in place, like any books that I gifted other people don't count, books that I bought for the book club don't count, etc. So 35 books that I bought new or used that I haven't actually read this year, haven't gotten a chance to read this year. 15 books that I bought for research purposes. I think that was allowed, but I think I did buy too many. Like I did splurge a little bit on my research interests books this year. So yeah, so that's a big number. And then I also bought, I think, around 20 books that I immediately read, and that most of the books I talked about in my last video were like newly purchased, but also finished like quite quickly after purchase. So overall, I think that number is 70. I think that's the number of books that I bought this year, and that's like quite a big number. I still think that's less than I bought in previous years, so I'm still like quite happy about that. Especially because a lot of them are secondhand. A lot of books that I acquired, I was also like gifted, or and I haven't counted them in that number, so I probably gained about like 100 books to my collection this year. But I've also been getting rid of books as and when I realized like, oh, I'm never gonna read that. Like, for example, like The Shining by Stephen King. For some reason I had that in my collection. I was like, why did I think I would want to read this? Like, I don't want to read this, and so I've gotten rid of that, for example. And because I work in a used bookshop, I often like will bring a few books that I'm like, okay, I've read this, I didn't like it, I'm gonna give it away, and then I have room in my library for new books. So yeah, that's the number. That's how many books I bought this year for that commenter that asked about it. There you go. And now for the final portion of this video. I was like, oh, it's not gonna be so long, like the stats video. I'm gonna edit it, it's gonna be short. It's literally been half an hour and I'm not even done. Wow. Okay, I really hope you guys are finding this as fun as I'm finding it. I love doing this. I love thinking and talking and hearing about people's like reading goals and reading stats and reading like habits and stuff. But yeah, hopefully this is entertaining for you too. So let's talk about the new year. Let's talk about what I'm going to do with that information. Like, first of all, I'm definitely going to keep using Storygraph. Storygraph is the best. This is not sponsored, okay? Like, just go and use Storygraph and add me as a friend and let's, like, watch out for each other's reading. You know, we love community around books. So definitely going to keep doing that because that has been really insightful for me to like help me realize what I've been reading and what I haven't been reading and like how long the things are and all this cool stuff like page count and things like that. But also like I clearly reading diversely is a real problem for me. I'm a literature student. I get assigned a lot of white people in my curriculum. I get assigned a lot of like classics, which are basically just European classics. So they exist for and by a Western audience. And that means that they're not written for me. I don't feel very seen by them. And I also am not supporting the non-Western publishing industry. And that upsets me. So I really want to be supporting more indie presses and I really want to be supporting like non-Western authors, even in translation, like that's fine as well. So my new year reading goals are gonna be way more measurable than last year. We're not just gonna say read diversely. We're gonna have goals, okay? So the way I frame these goals are as follows. To combat like the biggest discrepancy in my reading, which is what the Western versus non-Western divide, it's going to be that for each month that I read anything, because obviously there are months where I don't read things, or like there are weeks where I don't read things, and that's fine, and we're not going to judge myself for reading or not reading when I don't feel like it. It's fine. But for each month that I do read a book, I aim to read a book from a country that I haven't read from before. Now, I don't want to say like I've never read from the country before, because if it's been a few years, like read from that country again. And maybe I will develop a real like interest in the history and the culture of one specific country. So I don't want to just be reading diverse for diversity's sake, but I do want to expand my geography of what I'm reading. So I'm gonna try to read from basically 12 different countries this following year, but it might end up being less than that depending on my interest and depending on my actual reading. Like if I don't read for a month, it's fine. If I don't, like that's not a big deal. But yeah, I aim to read at least a book for every month that I read from a country that I either haven't read from at all, ever, or from a country that I haven't read from in at least a year. Like, let's, give myself that. And that's like a way for me to like improve my reading standards, my reading trends, right? The next biggest discrepancy in my reading that we have identified is horribly few people of color. So for every month that I read any book, I'm really gonna try to make that book by a non-white person. Like, really gonna do my best this year to do that. Especially if it's a non-white woman, like bonus points, but honestly, non-white person of any gender, non-binary, you know, cis male, like trans, any gender is absolutely a-okay as long as it's a non-white person, because oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm still like, this is 3 years into tracking my stats, 3 years into attempting to diversify my reading, and I still read so many white people. I'm just shook. So yeah, pretty straightforward. We're gonna try to read more people of color, and the way that I'm gonna do that is that for every month that I read anything, I'm gonna aim for that thing to be by a non-white person. Hopefully those two things, those previous two goals, intersect quite a lot, because like the more I read from like African and Middle Eastern authors, the more likely it is that those authors are not going to be white. So that's going to be great. Hopefully super easy. And then finally, although I didn't really like present this in my statistics of like last year, how many books did I read from like different languages or whatever, that's because I literally read 100% English this year. I aimed to read one book in Arabic, as I said at the beginning of the video. I did not read one book in Arabic. I read 40 pages in Arabic. I read one chapter of one book at the beginning of the year, and then I read nothing. Nothing else. And I think there's this weird thing that's happening. I have a theory that the reason that this is because I set myself such a small, tangible goal. This is the case with all my goals from this year, but like they were so small and tangible that I basically conned myself out of like doing a better job at them, because they were so easy. I just kept putting them off. I was like, I'll definitely do that. That's like so easy. And then I just didn't do them. So we're gonna challenge myself. We're gonna be ambitious this year. I know no moderation. I am an extreme person. I'm a Scorpio moon. Like, this is who I am, and I am unashamed about it. We're gonna try to read a lot of Arabic this year. We're gonna try to read 6 full books in Arabic, okay? One book wasn't enough to get me motivated, to get me feeling the pressure trying to read in Arabic. So this year we're trying to read 6 books. In my notes I say like 6 books in languages that aren't English. I don't know if I'm gonna allow that. I don't know if I'm gonna allow like a substitute like German book or French book or something like that. I do want to read 6 books in Arabic. And then if I also read a German book and if I also read a French book, like that would be awesome. But at the moment, I'm just focusing on my mother tongue. If I'm gonna improve my Arabic, I gotta read. And it's so sad that my brain it just doesn't want to. It just doesn't want to read in Arabic. Like, I can read just fine in Arabic, but it's like, I don't understand like one word every like sentence. And I just don't want to look it up and like have to learn it in a vocabulary list. And like the whole process just ends up being like really stressful for me. So I don't do it. But actually, I need to reframe it and realize that the reason I want to do this is because I want to be a better speaker in Arabic, and I want to be a better, like, I want my comprehension to improve when I listen to like people who speak with like a Gulf dialect, or you know, whatever, like people who speak with more formal dialects of Arabic. And like the only way to do that is if I can freaking read. So this year we're trying to read 6 Arabic books. I'm putting it on the record. I am making it happen. It's fine if they're in translation. I'm not really like nitpicky about, oh, is it translated, is it not translated, like whatever. If it's an English book that's been translated into Arabic, if I've already read it, it's probably going to be easier for me to keep reading it. So all the better, like why not? But yeah, that's basically it. We're trying to read from different countries. We're trying to read from different people. We're trying to read in different languages. That's the idea for next year's reading. As I said, I don't really set myself numerical goals. In this case, like 6 Arabic books is a numerical goal, but it's just a way for me to try to motivate myself with like an ambitious goal to just read in Arabic, because honestly, it's despicable how many years it's been since I've read an entire book in my own mother tongue. And I've never been a big reader in Arabic. Like, ever since I was a young reader, like, I was reading in English, and that's how I fell in love with reading. But like, there's so much cool Arabic literature out there. I've discovered so many cool like indie presses and magazines and like poets that do amazing stuff, and it's all in Arabic, and I want to be able to access it, and I can. I just got to push myself out of my comfort zone a little bit. So I might make another video about that if anyone is interested, or if you have recommendations of like easy books in Arabic, possibly poems or plays or nonfiction. I'm not going to be reading fiction, let's be real. Nonfiction in Arabic, like, send them my way. But yeah, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I would love to know how your reading year went, and like, let me know any stats. What is the oldest book that you read this year in terms of publication date? What is the newest book that you read this year? Do you read new books, old books, majority, big books, short books? Let's have debates about books in the comments. And thank you so much for watching and for being here this year. It's been a really rough year for me, and I'm sure it has for many people, but I'm sending you so much love out there, and I'm just really excited for the new year. I love the new year. It doesn't matter like if there's a pandemic going on, like nothing can take the new year joy away from me, because there's something about the moving of the calendar, the turn from December to Jan, and I love it. So like, let's share some ambitious goals in the comments with me. Let's share some love, and thanks for sticking around this year. I really appreciate you. I hope you're taking care of yourself. I hope you are healthy and well, and your family is too, and I will see you in the new year. Bye.